Wishing you a good afternoon from the Working Class Movement Library, and particular welcome to our speaker today. Cyril Pearce has been a great friend of the library over the years, and his work on World War I conscientious objectors has been immense and has culminated in an eagerly awaited book, Communities of Resistance, and that's what he's going to talk to us about today. So over to you, Cyril.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. First of all, after that slight hiatus, can I thank Lynette and her colleagues for rescuing me? And thank you all for turning up. In particular, I see one or two very familiar faces in the gallery there. People who have helped enormously, one way or another, in the work I've been engaged in now for an awful long time. So I'd like to thank them very publicly, although I think I've thanked them all in the book in the appropriate places. In a few days' time, we'll be entering the Remembrance Day period and all that that means in terms of remembering the dead of 2 world wars and countless other wars of one kind or another over the last 100, 150 years. There'll be ceremonies at places like this in northern France, Belgium. There'll similarly be ceremonies in local war memorials. And of course, since I'm from Huddersfield, and Huddersfield will get a mention again this afternoon, as it always does, then here's the Grand Huddersfield War Memorial, where on Sunday, I think it is, this coming weekend, there'll be the appropriate commemoration process. I think at this time, it's also well worth remembering, and certainly this meeting is about that, in part anyway, remembering the contribution to the resistance to war made in Britain and many other parts of the world by those who refused to fight, conscientious objectors, and those who supported them, men, women, and often families of many different kinds. And it's something about that I want to speak about this afternoon. My first contacts, if you like, with the history of the anti-war movement in Britain in the First World War came in meetings for very different reasons with these 3 people from my own hometown of Huddersfield. Wilfred Whiteley, Arthur Gardiner, Florence Shaw were all active in Labour and socialist politics in Huddersfield in the years before the First World War and during it. Wilf and Arthur both were conscientious objectors. Florence was one of those many young teenagers within the anti-war movement in Huddersfield who leafleted, who attended meetings, who campaigned from the beginning of the war effectively right to the very end and beyond in opposition to the war and in support of conscientious objectors. And I had the privilege of meeting them, all 3 of them on various occasions a long time ago, during the course of which they said something which at that time I found fascinating but didn't do much about. What they said was that Huddersfield was special. And many of you will have heard me say this before. Huddersfield was special in the First World War. It was special because of the number of members of the anti-war movement, in particular the number of its conscientious objectors, because it was able to continue campaigning against the war, the anti-war movement that is, throughout 1914 through to 1919, and because after the war was over, many of those leading figures in the local anti-war movement, either in Huddersfield or further afield, became public persons in their own right. Wilf Whiteley, for example, was briefly Labour Member of Parliament for Ladywood in Birmingham. Percy Ellis, who was another key figure in the anti-war movement in Huddersfield, became General Secretary of the Textile Workers Union. And Arthur Gardiner had perhaps the most remarkable career of all. He became a local councillor, eventually Mayor of Huddersfield, and despite his reputation as an anti-war rebel in 1914, 1918, was made an honorary freeman of the borough. That added up to quite a special account, it seemed to me, and it rather contradicted the versions of the First World War anti-war movement that I had come across. Most versions at that time, and this is in the late 20th century, 1970s, 1980s, most versions at that time, notwithstanding David Bolton's excellent work, were about a movement which was an infinitesimally small minority, making a lot of noise in its own way, but achieving very little. Well, I think you could say it probably achieved very little in terms of stopping the war, but the evidence of Huddersfield suggests that it achieved rather a lot, or certainly more than the suggestion of minority would suggest. Out of that series of interviews came a research project which was investigating the suggestion, in fact, the assertion that Wilf, Arthur, Florence, and others made about Huddersfield's specialness. And that resulted in Comrades in Conscience, first published in 2001, published as a new edition in 2014. And the book really summarized all those elements of specialness and something of the social and communal nature of the anti-war movement in Huddersfield. And of course, at the end of it, you're left with the question, was what I found about Huddersfield so unusual as to be hardly worth bothering about? Was that specialness, if you like, quirky, off the wall and unusual? Or was it suggesting something else? Were there other quirky, special places like Huddersfield? Or rather more dramatic, perhaps, was the anti-war movement in the First World War rather more as a consequence of the accumulation of places like Huddersfield than we had hitherto thought? Trying to answer that collection of questions has really been the work of a very long time. And it began, and indeed it continues, with the accumulation of evidence as best we can, and it has to be we, because the work done to accumulate this database of First World War conscience objectors is a collective effort. All right, so I began the process and I've done the lion's share, but I've been helped enormously by a significant army of people, and I must thank them now here, who have contributed amendments, corrections, additions, and so on. And here's one of the earliest sheets of data about a World War I conscience objector that I added to the database, which now, by the way, comprises, I just did the numbers this morning, 19,919 conscience objector data sheets, rather like this. Some as detailed as this, many of them fairly thin in terms of detail, but here is a rather well-filled data sheet. You can see the name of the man at the top of the page there, Leonard Renton, all the way from well close view in Brunswick, the Brunswick ward of Leeds. Across the other side, we've got his age, his status, what he did for a living, and interestingly enough, in the motivation box, something of why he became a conscience objector. He was a member of the International Bible Students Association. These days, we call them Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, they changed their name in 1932 to Jehovah's Witnesses. But he was one of a number of Bible students from Leeds. You can see as we go down the address that it's Leeds, it's the West Riding, and so on. You can probably also see something in these different boxes of what happened to Leonard Renton during his war. His arrest and being taken to Leeds magistrates in April 1916 because he failed to answer his call-up. You can see that he was drafted into the non-combatant corps and so on. What we will also see, if you can read this on your screen, in this particular service details box, NCC 2 of the 516 York, that's where he was supposed to join up, 2nd Northern Detachment of the Non-Combatant Corps. He was sent to Richmond Castle. And in Richmond Castle, he disobeyed and was court-martialed and sentenced to 6 months, commuted to 4 months. But while he was under sentence and supposed to have been sent to prison, he was taken out to France. He was one of the 16 Richmond Castle conscience objectors, known as the Richmond 16, who were part of that 35 conscience objectors sent out to France, where they continued to disobey, were sent to Field General Court Martial here at Boulogne in June 1916, and were all sentenced to death. Their sentences were commuted to 10 years penal servitude. Now that data has formed the basis for further calculations. Here's an example of what I've been doing with the numbers of COs that appear in the database. Here in the top, in this splendid set of maps devised by Helen Durham from the Geography Department at Leeds University, we have two ways of expressing the CO numbers. I hope you're familiar with my calling conscience objectors COs. It's a damn sight easier to say CO than conscience objector all the time. But here we've got a map of, would you believe, Hertfordshire. And here it's the map of Hertfordshire. At the time of the First World War, all these boundaries and subdivisions are the different local government areas within Hertfordshire. Each of these local government areas will be urban districts, there'll be rural districts and so on. Here, for example, the most complicated one. Here we've got Hitchin urban district right in the middle of what in fact is Hitchin rural district around it, and a very large red dot. I'll explain that in a moment. All these dots are a kind of visual representation of the CO numbers for Hertfordshire. Now, fine, it may well be that those CO numbers simply reflect the number of people living in that particular part of Hertfordshire, in which case one must be questioning why there's a huge, great big red dot that represents actually 73 conscience objectors here in Hertford, in Hitchin rural. Down here, you'd expect this red dot because that's Watford. So what's going on? Well, the second set of calculations, after we've done the simple numbers calculation, is about trying to find out the proportion of eligible males in the different parts of the country. And here in the case of Hertfordshire, the aim is still the same. How many men of every 1,000 eligible males refuse to fight? And then we translate that into what I call a CO index down here. Yeah. And you can see that immediately we go from the numbers map to the CO index map. We have a very interesting picture for something which is a fairly small population, that is Hitchin Rural District. What's going on? Well, what's going on is that in the middle of Hitchin Rural District, we have the new and model town of Letchworth. I'll be saying a little bit more about Letchworth later on, but that establishes, I think, the methodology. Here are the numbers. Here's what those numbers mean in terms of the proportion of the eligible male population. Now, over the years, I've tried to get a sense of what was going on across the nation. And to try to find out what was going on in England, Scotland, and Wales. It resulted in a great doorstep of a book. I think you could just about see it. It's a thick thing. It's the kind of thing that you might use to prop furniture up if you lose a leg or a caster or something. And it's hardback, so it might do the job quite well and for a long time. But I can't at all, in the space of time I have this afternoon, talk about every detail in the book. Suffice it to say that in the space of about 550 pages, I've tried to summarize something of the results of that hunt for other Huddersfields. And in the same time, try to do justice for places which don't quite pass muster in terms of other Huddersfields. In selecting the places I've concentrated on, I've looked at the CO numbers, the simple numbers themselves. the CO index, in other words, the COs per 1,000 eligible men, and the two together. Here is my starting point. Huddersfield had 121 COs and a CO index of 6.41. That, if you like, is my datum line. And if you read through the book, and it'll take you a while to get through to the end, if you read through the book, you'll find that everything in the book, every settlement in the book that I look at, is judged against the specialness of Huddersfield. Well, we'll come back to that specialness in a minute. And when you look at the numbers that you've got on the screen now, perhaps I need to stand back from my claims of specialness for Huddersfield. 26 places had more COs than Huddersfield. Yeah. 59 places had a much higher CO index. 5 places outscored Huddersfield both in terms of their numbers and index. Croydon, Bristol, Croydon, Hornsey, Rochdale and York. And in fact, talking about outscoring, Bristol, to whom I have now, or to which I have now surrendered the title of specialness, also outscored Huddersfield Town last night in the match, which is a source of some concern to me, but there you are. They were the better side. Croydon, always a surprise to me. True Blue Croydon, very high CO score, very considerable CO index number, and so on. And some of the others, equally interesting. If you look at the top 10 places in the CO index, many of which are considered in the book, I'll say something more about Aberavon and Britton Ferry in a moment or two, but all of these are fairly small places in comparison with Huddersfield, but have a great deal to say in their own right about the nature of the anti-war movement across the country. Aberavon, you see, 73 conscience objectors, has a CO index which is many, many times greater than Huddersfield's. Even Mytholmroyd, although a smaller number of COs, a much higher CO index, and so on. And even Settle, a rural part of the northern part of the West Riding, a significant CO index, although inevitably a lower CO score. Now, the selection of places within the book is based on those numbers. The four, I've divided them into two parts: hotspots, based on numbers and CO index. And in those hotspots, you've got Bristol, Croydon, as you'd expect, the top two of that list of places with both CO index and numbers higher than Huddersfield. And because their numbers were quite remarkable, Aberavon and Britton Ferry in Glamorgan in South Wales, and Letchworth in Hitchin Rural District in Hertfordshire. Here's the Bristol and Gloucestershire figure, or the map rather. Here you can see very clearly Bristol in the southern part of Gloucestershire. Much of Gloucestershire, compared with Bristol, fairly low scoring county. Some fairly modest places. Gloucester itself had a modestly good number of conscience objectors, but Bristol by far the more important in terms of numbers. Of course, it's by far the more important in terms of population anyway. But if we look also at the, hang on, we're not seeing, I don't want to see that. There we are. Down here's Bristol, right at the very bottom, showing up on the CO index colour scale as being rather more important in terms of COs per 1,000 than other places. The interesting thing about Bristol, and this is perhaps a reflection of the sheer variety of places across Britain, is that the movement there was unique to Bristol, as all the movements are unique to their own places, it has to be said. But it was unique in the sense that being very broad-based. Huddersfield was broad-based in a way, but in terms of social class, fairly limited to working and lower middle class. The Bristol social class background of its CEOs, much broader. The role of the Quaker movement, the Society of Friends in Bristol, much more significant, both in terms of the numbers and in terms of the support given to the anti-war movement in Bristol. And in fact, the predecessor organisations in Bristol campaigning for peace in the Boer War and much earlier than that are very well represented in Bristol. But at the same time, Bristol has its own representatives of what you might call the political wing of the anti-war movement, a very strong and growing independent Labour Party presence. The leading figure, of course, of which is Walter Ailes, a very strong contribution from women in Bristol. Walter's wife, and of course, Mabel Tothill, a very important Quaker woman, very active in Bristol social work, and particularly active, in fact, the leading figure in Bristol's anti-war movement, no conscription fellowship. A very important set of elements, if you like, in the anti-war community that constituted Bristol, and perhaps one of the reasons why the anti-war movement in Bristol was so well supported, well organised, and dynamic. Walter Ailes went on to become one of Bristol's members of Parliament, and many other members of the Bristol anti-war community established firm reputations in Bristol's local politics and in its social and cultural life. Here is the Surrey map with Croydon in the top corner here, clearly outshining, not just in terms of its own population, everywhere else in the county in terms of the size, 190, of its CEO community. It shows up on this CEO index map fairly well, although not in the highest category, the red category as in the others, but nevertheless demonstrating what's going on there. Croydon's different. It is like some of the examples I'll be talking about in Middlesex. It is subject to what we might call the Greater London effect. Much of Croydon, by the time of the First World War, much of Croydon's working population was beginning to become a commuter population. The army, if you like, of the black-coated proletariat become apparent in Croydon as they start to commute into central London to all manner of jobs there. So it's a very different place from certainly parts of the country that I want to talk about in a moment or two, and yet has its own dynamic. They're a much more ethically driven community with a smaller labour movement, I think it's true to say, although a quite vigorous one. A very important, rather like Bristol, a very important and supportive Quaker community, both in Croydon itself and further afield in the areas immediately around it, in Croydon Rural District and so on. Here is Glamorgan, South Wales. Here are Britton Ferry and Aberavon. And you can see what happens when we transfer the numbers map to the CO index map. Immediately Aberavon and Britton Ferry and Bridgend too, to a lesser extent, outshine the rest. There are particular explanations as to reasons as to why the map of Glamorgan, although on the whole fairly radical territory politically, largely dominated by the Liberal Party at the time of the First World War, later to be dominated by the Independent Labour Party, shows up Britton Ferry and Aberavon here. Britton Ferry and Aberavon at the time of the First World War were gradually becoming strongholds of the Independent Labour Party. The interesting thing about Britton Ferry and Aberavon and their characteristic during the war is the extent to which they were working class communities with a working class political presence and whose anti-war movement, unlike that of Bristol or Croydon, was largely working and low middle class. There is little presence of the Quaker element in the anti-war community of Britton Ferry and Aberavon. So we're dealing with a different sort of community here, but nonetheless, a community with a very strong anti-war tradition, of whose conscientious objectors, the vast majority became what we call absolutists. They refused any accommodation with the wartime state, refused the Home Office scheme, and decided to spend the rest of their war in prison. Yeah, hang on. There we are. If we look, I'm going back. Forgive me, I've gone backwards. So those are hotspots. It struck me when looking through the data that there were parts of the country where the number of what might be described as CO hotspots was greater than anywhere else. And areas where, rather than considering, if you like, almost isolated examples of war resister communities, we should extend the notion and call them heartland areas. And much as it pains me as a Yorkshireman, I have to say that one of these prime places is Lancashire. And here we have Lancashire's CO numbers. You can see Manchester here and Liverpool, both because they're major cities, will have a higher CO number anyway. But what's really interesting when you start to look at the CO numbers is when you start to look at them in the Pennine area here. What some scholars call Cotton Lancashire. And Cotton Lancashire, as far as the anti-war movement is concerned, is very important. It constitutes virtually a heartland of almost connected anti-war communities. Here are the CO index colours for that part of Lancashire. You can see most of the rest of Lancashire fairly undistinguished in terms of the number of its anti-war communities, the number of its COs. But here in Pennine, Lancashire, two places stand out. Nelson, Rawtenstall. Nelson, because of the number of its COs, it had at least 100. Its high CO number well in excess of that of Huddersfield, as in the case of Rawtenstall. Both of them intensely working class communities. Rawtenstall, the world manufacturing centre for slippers, would you believe? And that particular dimension of the cotton textile trade. Nelson, by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, as something of a heartland for the Independent Labour Party. Nelson, Rawtenstall similarly, but not quite as stalwart. Nelson also, where you find the ILP closely linked to nonconformist Methodism, particularly one brand of nonconformist Methodism in Nelson at the Salem Independent Methodist Chapel. Most of the leaders of Nelson's anti-war community were associated in one way or another with that chapel. Very much like Aberavon and Britton Ferry in that sense. The link between socialism and nonconformity, very marked, and to some extent very marked too, when you look at Rawtenstall. And then the second of my heartlands, Middlesex. Like Croydon, Middlesex is very much a subject, if you like, of the London effect. Like Croydon, is having the same kind of effect on its occupations, on its population, on the dynamics of its urban growth. Parts of Middlesex here, Tottenham, Hornsey, Willesden, demonstrating significant numbers of conscience objectors on both the numbers maps and on the, if you like, the heat maps for CO proportions of eligible males. Here we have very much the dynamic that we can see taking place in Croydon. And the additional element, I think, which is important in London, that even if within any of those areas, Willesden, Hornsey, Tottenham, not all of the organisational elements present elsewhere are present, then at least they are across the border into radical parts of North London, such as Islington, whose name continues to be associated with radicalism, as I'm sure you're aware, and of course, Hackney. They constitute an area of North London that tends to get referred to as such, an area within which the Herald League was important and the organisations related to the Herald League. And so we have a very interesting mixture, a diverse community of left-wing radicals of all kinds of political persuasions, and at the same time, certainly within Tottenham, a strong Quaker element too. And of course, I couldn't, having included Lancashire in my heartland areas, I couldn't avoid referring to and including Yorkshire too. After all, Huddersfield, my special place starting point, is in Yorkshire. And here we have the West Riding of Yorkshire maps. Here, Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, Sheffield, yeah, and York. Again, Huddersfield we know about the specialness of Huddersfield and the numbers and the CO index and so on. Bradford and Leeds, big CO numbers because they are big places, comparatively speaking, certainly compared with Huddersfield. Sheffield, less so interesting. That's a story I haven't told in the book, but needs telling sometime. And then when we do the heat map version of it, we expect Huddersfield to stand up in some way. But what's happening here in North Yorkshire? Settle rural district with a modestly sized CO number stands out as perhaps the most CO active community in the whole of the West Riding. Well, here we've got another unique set of combined factors. It was a rural settlement with a great deal of farming going on, and in it, at Bentham, Low Bentham and High Bentham, two late 17th century, early 18th century Quaker settlements. Two very important and influential Quaker meetings, and influential and important leaders of those meetings who all took the anti-war line. A very small branch of the Independent Labour Party. So in Settle, you could argue that unlike Nelson, unlike to some extent Huddersfield, and certainly unlike South Wales, the leading figures in the anti-war movement and the centres of the anti-war movement are the local Friends meeting houses, particularly that at Low Bentham. Many of the members of the Low Bentham meeting became absolutists. Some of them served time in Richmond Castle and further afield. So we have an interesting departure, if you like, from the otherwise urban feel of war resistor communities in the rest of Britain. Now, I've stressed the variety of war resistor communities, and we can go on doing that. I think you'll find war resistor communities in Scotland are also very different. Glasgow has a reputation for being resistant to the war and for making its own statement as to the war. Much of that's to do with the wartime conditions of working in Glasgow's industry, but surprisingly, Glasgow has a very small, comparatively speaking, bearing in mind the size of its population, comparatively small CO element. What element there is in Glasgow, something like 300 COs, I seem to remember, were very militant, but in terms of the community as a whole and in terms of Glasgow's reputation as being one of the many members of the awkward squad in the First World War, Glasgow's reputation is not well served by the paucity of the number of its COs. Dundee, on the other hand, and Edinburgh, a much stronger CO presence, but again for very different reasons. Dundee, for example, we have a strong Independent Labour Party. We have a small Quaker presence, but one of the crucially different figures is the anti-war movement in Dundee. And this only happens in Dundee. There's a certain element of it in Croydon too. The anti-war element in Dundee is substantially supported by the prohibitionist movement. Edwin Scrimgeour, who has his own prohibitionist journal, throws the weight of that journal, which is very popular behind the anti-war movement, one of the leading figures who later became a key figure in the post-war Communist Party of Great Britain, Rob Stewart, was also a prohibition campaigner, so north of the border, resisting the war has a distinctly teetotal flavour to it. Now, that really opens up the possibility of thinking about different sorts of resistance to the war. One of the things I've done with the numbers is to try to make them reflect something of the nature of the war resisters stance. I've called it the war resisters, the war service element. And here are all the CEOs from Huddersfield and what they did in the war. There are about 13 of the 121. I have no idea what they did. If anybody can help me with that, I'd appreciate it. So the numbers are therefore undermined a little by more than 10% of them being unknown. No absolute exemptions. One man whose conscience objector was agreed, but he was dismissed for service because he wasn't up to it. And then we start to go down. These are the important categories. Court martial, 33 men in Huddersfield who refused to compromise were court-martialed, sent to prison. 9 of them became, as you can see, absolutists. Here we got others. Friends Ambulance Unit or the Friends War Victims Relief Service, 11 men there, most of them Quakers, but not all. 11 men joined the non-combatant corps. In other words, they agreed to serve as non-combatants. No men, as I know of, joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, and 47 men became employed on work of national importance of one kind or another. Yeah, I've added a certain rider to these numbers. If we add up the ones who refused to cooperate, those court-martialed, those who ran away, yeah, 36 altogether, yeah. These are the men I've called the resistors. There are other people here who were resisting to the idea of war and consider themselves conscience objectors, but who actually cooperated in some way with the war effort, albeit as humanitarians. The non-combatant corps, Friends Ambulance Unit, and so on, work of national importance, preferably not work in war-related activity, but nevertheless contributing in some way to the war effort. And I've separated those into resistors and cooperators. You can see that 29, nearly 30% of Huddersfield CEOs decided to resist. The rest cooperated in some way. Now, if you start to look at the arguments within the anti-war movement in the First World War, that's a fairly important distinction, fairly important division within the anti-war community. Not that I think anybody thought the worse of anyone else, but simply that those figures are important in suggesting the breadth and diversity within the anti-war community. And out of those numbers, you should be able to see on the very bottom line a ratio of resistors to cooperators. And if Huddersfield is regarded as being somehow a datum for all of that, then 1 to 1.97 is about the figure I want you to bear in mind. Now we can use those resistor-cooperator ratios to try to get a sense of the different sorts of resistance that we could find across the country. The most resistant areas, in other words, 1 resistor to less than 1 cooperator, not surprisingly, Britton Ferry and Aberavon, where the CEOs were 100% resistors. And many of those were absolutists. No cooperators to speak of in that part of the world. Is there a correlation between that and the political and social background of those war resistor communities? I'm not sure I have an answer to that. A simplistic answer would be to say that the working class communities mobilized to oppose the war were on the whole more determined in their resistance. I'm not sure that that holds water. but it's a working hypothesis worth going with. Some communities had, if you like, an even balance, or an approaching even balance, of resistors to cooperators. Manchester, for example, where you find 50% of the Manchester's substantial war resistor population, or its conscientious objector population, were resistors. The other 50% cooperated in one of those different ways I identified earlier on. Same is true of Norwich, where surprisingly for a rural and largely agricultural city, or a city in a largely agricultural area, Norwich had a very strong anti-war community. And what about those who, you might say, match the Huddersfield resistor of one resistor to two cooperators? There are quite a few of those. The most cooperative of the anti-war communities I've come across, interesting, one resistor to more than 3 cooperators. Croydon, 1 to 5, and the most cooperative anti-war community that I've come across, if you're following all this, Finchley in North London. There may be some hints as to the nature of the cooperators' commitment in their backgrounds. I offer this as only a partial answer, not a full answer. Clearly, the cooperation offered by members of the Friends Ambulance Unit, who were not all Quakers, but the substantial majority were Quakers, is clearly demonstrated. There were those Quakers who felt it important, and who are we to gainsay them, who felt it important to make a humanitarian contribution to the war effort and to relieve suffering, and have been doing so in the Friends Ambulance Unit and the Friends War Victims Relief Service since the latter part of the 19th century, certainly in the Friends War Victims Relief Service. You may find a similar pattern here within the non-combatant corps, because all these men in their non-combatant corps uniform, all of them sporting the cap badge, and I'll say something about it in a moment, were members of the Plymouth Brethren. Plymouth Brethren decided that they wouldn't oppose the war in its entirety, but would declare themselves willing to serve, but not as combatants. And they became, if you like, the major influence, I think it's true to say, in the nature of the non-combatant corps, most of which served in barracks across Britain. They were largely based with the home forces, but others of which went out to France and served behind the lines in France, as it were, hewing wood and drawing water, working in supply depots and so on. Here's the cap badge I mentioned earlier on. The reason why I mention this in particular is that the NCC cap badge was regarded by some soldiers as the mark of Cain, if you like. And people like NCC members who decided that they wanted to go into the local town in France for a cup of tea or a bun or a pint or whatever it was, studiously avoided displaying their cap badge. NCC cap badge was a clear invitation, according to the records we have, for NCC men to get beaten up. Here's the Friends Ambulance Unit. This is a draft, newly qualified from Jordan's, their training centre in the south of England, before going out to serve in Belgium, in France, in hospitals across Britain. Now, as far as the resistors are concerned, some of them decided that being an absolutist wasn't quite enough. They decided, as we say in Slowit, to take the rook and go and disappear. Here are a bunch of COs on Dartmoor convict prison. They'd all been sentenced to prison. They'd all been released from prison. They'd all accepted the Home Office scheme. And here they are, not looking too unhappy about it, especially this one in the middle, having their photograph taken while working at Dartmoor prison, which had been deconsecrated, if that's the right word, decommissioned as a prison in the First World War to serve as a work centre for conscientious objectors. The man in the middle of the front row of the middle row here, Harry Riding, is an independent Labour Party member from Newport in Monmouthshire. Shortly after this photograph was taken, he and half a dozen of the chaps on this picture decided they'd had enough of Dartmoor. They'd had enough of the life of a CO under, if you like, the authorities' control, and they walked away. Some of them were rearrested and sent back to Dartmoor after a term in prison, but Harry managed to get across to Southern Ireland, where he was welcomed by an Irish nationalist community in Cork. He was provided with farm work on farmland outside Cork and was happily working there as a CO on the run for a number of months until the local branch of the Irish Brotherhood decided that he might well be an English spy. So on the one hand, having escaped the English authorities in fleeing to Ireland, he now had to escape the Irish nationalists who had a fairly sharp way of dealing with those they considered to be English spies. He went back via Dublin, across the Irish Sea to Liverpool, and eventually, interestingly enough, ended up working under an assumed name in a textile mill in that special place, Huddersfield. Another of those men, and here looking very prosperous in his post-war persona, post-Second World War actually, in the 1950s, is another of those fugitives. He decided at a very early stage that his resistance was going to go all the way, and he left Huddersfield, where he was born and bred, Archie Key, went all the way to Liverpool, and in Liverpool, where there was an escape route to North America for Irish rebels fleeing from the authorities, the man who organized that escape route was prepared to accept conscientious objectors who wanted to take the same route, should they meet his exacting standards for their political attitude. Now, Archie Key was a very left-wing socialist, and the agent in Liverpool said, well, that'll do nicely, ticked his box, and away he went. Settled in New York for some time, and eventually became a Canadian citizen, where he established himself as a journalist and a key figure in the whole business of Canadian arts and the community. The book tries to reflect much of that. There are individual stories in each of the selected case study areas. The numbers are balanced, I hope, with the anecdotal and with the personal. And that's, in a sense, the end of that part of my research story. But as you probably know, research starts generating new questions. What to do next? Whether it's me doing it or someone else doing it, I rather hope it's someone else doing it. I'm getting too old for new research. But there are things that need to be done. The database needs to be made more accurate. It needs to be extended to that magic 20,000. And perhaps it also needs its own dedicated website. Advice on that I would welcome. We need to know a little bit more about the CO underground, supporting those COs who went on the run. Doesn't necessarily have to be the ones who went to North America, but there's a whole network, a web, if you like, of CO contacts, safe houses, escape places across England, Scotland, and Wales that we only know a fraction about. More importantly, and I think this is crucial, we really do need to know more about the women who supported the anti-war movement. Their role in the anti-war movement is glimpsed as through a glass darkly. There'll be key figures here and there, like Mabel Tothill, and the fascinating group of Manchester women that Ali Ronan's discovered supporting the anti-war cause in Manchester. But they're precious few in terms of the wider understanding we have of the anti-war community. We do need more micro studies. Some of the studies that I haven't been able to deal with need to be visited and fleshed out. And perhaps Since the book is simply a selection of places and not the whole of them, we really need to start working towards a real gazetteer of the anti-war communities of Britain in the First World War. Thank you.
I'm hoping that we are back in the room. Are you all seeing me, or are you seeing something else? Yes, right. Thank you very much indeed to Cyril, and we are getting some virtual applause. That is sadly the way of it, as you can imagine, but there is a lot of it. And yeah, I think anybody who has heard you today or has heard you in the past is not going to let you retire from this, because you always have new and extraordinary things to tell us. So it is great that you are looking at things that need to be done in the future. And yeah, but we can only applaud what you have done to date. And I'm going to encourage people to ask questions. There is a couple of things which have come up already, so I will just start off. As somebody who had to go and said they were really sorry, but they're going to catch up on the YouTube later. So the question, which I've now lost, is where's it gone? While I'm looking for it, there's another great anecdote here. Somebody says, saw Cyril's book this morning in All Good Bookshop in North London, as befits Hornsey. They will post anywhere and deliver locally by bike. So there's a good free advert for an independent bookshop. Right, I've now lost the question there, but that's really strange. Okay, while I'm trying to find that, has anybody else got a question? Does anyone want to wave to me to ask Cyril a question? Right, yes, Pete Strong, yes, thank you. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
First of all, many thanks to Cyril for that talk, and I'm speaking from South Wales, so particularly pleased to see Wales getting a mention. I would just chip in there to say that for people who aren't familiar with South Wales, Aberavon is better known as Port Talbot nowadays, so that will place it for you. And especially pleased to hear you mention Harry Riding. I've done a lot of work on Harry because he came from Newport, and I'm sure Cyril is aware, but other people probably aren't, but there's a wonderful diary written by Harry's girlfriend from Newport, which is, yeah, I see Cyril nodding, yeah, which is held in what's called the People's Collection Wales, which is the website held by the National Library of Wales. So if you Google Harry M. Riding, you will find it there. The diary is wrongly catalogued as being 1915. I think that's because the opening page faces a 1915 calendar, as 1916 diaries do. It's clearly 1916 because, of course, there was no conscription in 1915. So well worth having a look at that. And I've gone through the local newspapers from Newport to try to add to the story that his girlfriend Florence Jones tells, and it's a wonderful story. So many thanks for that. So the question I wanted to ask in relation to your talk was, do you think your figures at all are skewed by the proportion of local men who were in reserved occupations? I'm thinking, for example, on your map of Glamorgan, the people of Merthyr would be very upset only to be in bright yellow and not in red, given that being anti-war was known as the Merthyr disease in these parts. And that whole area, what we call the heads of the valleys, which is the northern fringe of the southwest coalfield, was very militant and a lot of anti-war activity. And of course there would be towns and villages up there, places like Abercleary across the border in Monmouthshire and so on, where virtually every man was a coal miner and so in a reserved occupation. Whereas maybe Croydon, we had all those commuters, not so many in reserved occupations. Just to bring that down to a well-known individual example, Nye Bevan from Tadiga. Now, Nye Bevan isn't listed as a conscientious objector, but he was briefly jailed for refusing to obey the call-up. He was a coal miner at the time. He was called up, refused to go on grounds that there were only a certain number of men being called up from each pit in an agreement with the South Wales Miners Federation, and the quota for his pit had already been met. And so he wasn't a conscience objector, but I think he would have been had he not been a coal miner. So I just wonder if your figures may be skewed in any way by those sort of situations.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
I'm still on. Oh, good. Thanks for that, Pete. Yes. I'm not sure we can make a comparison between Port Talbot, Aberafon, Britton Ferry, and Croydon. There are issues there too, I think, but we'll put that to one side. The figures generally, I think, and I do make a point of this in the book, anybody who's read the book already will probably know that, but the figures in terms of COs and war reserved occupations are very difficult to unravel. You look at most coalfield areas, South Wales, the Midlands, Northumberland, Durham, you will find significant proportions of those populations are in war reserved occupations. The same is true of South Yorkshire. And so it's very difficult to get past that to where the COs are. Many of those who refuse to serve for the reason that you gave, that Nye Bevan refused to serve, that they were in a war exempt occupation and they should therefore not be called up. Nye Bevan may very well have been opposed to the war, and there may very well have been other war resistors within the South Wales mining community, and I dare say there were hundreds of them, but they didn't have to stand the test because they were reserved, their occupation. And in fact, when some went before, there was a case, I think, in it may well have been in Merthyr, where several hundred COs were brought before, 148 I think it was, were brought before the local tribunal. They pleaded their case, but the case was dismissed because they were all in war reserved occupations. So their CO statement was set to one side. And you'll find this happening across the country. That's why, and you're right to use the word skew, that's why the figures are skewed, because men in war reserved occupations, even if they came to a tribunal, seldom had their CO heard, and were usually simply exempt military service on account of the fact they were in a war reserved occupation. So there's a very interesting area there. I've tried to get a sense of it in a part of the book which deals with Northumberland, and touched on it in other parts of the book dealing with areas such as South Wales, but it's awfully difficult to get a really clear steer.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes?
Yeah. Many thanks for that, and I very much take your point about they didn't have to face the test. And of course, Bevan got criticised for not coming out as a conscience objector and therefore not having to face the test. I don't think that was fair criticism, but it was a point that was made against him. So many thanks for that. Can I just quickly ask, the information about what happened to Harry going to Ireland and so on, that's not in the diary. I just wonder what your source for that is.
I met Harry's son and granddaughter. His son sadly passed away shortly after I met him. People I meet have a tendency to do that, sadly. But his daughter's still with us, alive and well, and she must have been the one who deposited the diary.
She was,
She also has a rather fine portrait of Harry, which was taken while he was in a Home Office scheme centre, while he was on Dartmoor actually, and rendered in pastels. I was able to get it restored for her and framed and glazed, and now apparently it has pride of place in her house. I'm very proud of that.
Excellent. Okay, yes, I did meet her actually, a couple of years back. Yeah. So thanks very much for that. That's great.
Thanks. That's a good story. Thank you, Pete. And thanks to Dan for rescuing for me the question which had got lost along the way. Could you explain, Cyril, where you find the record of COs which you've used to create your stats?
How long we got? I'll just take you through the chronology of how I began. I began simply by going through the copies of the No Conscription Fellowship's newspaper, the Tribunal. And in it, during 1916 and beyond, they listed the names of COs and where they came from in brackets, often hopelessly inaccurately, but that was my start. I then went through The Friend, which also carries lists of COs. And I went through those and recorded them. So we had, by the end of that, several thousand COs on the database, but nowhere near the 19,919 I currently have. And then it's a matter of looking elsewhere. It is possible to tease out CO names and details from the surviving military service records of the non-combatant corps. Most COs who came into the army were non-combatant corps men, even if they refused to serve as non-combatant corps men. And you will find their records in the Burnt Records series that are now online and have been for some time. So that was another source. A further source was in what we call the Judge Advocate General's registers of courts martial. And they were there too. So a variety of sources, autograph books in local record offices, trawling through local newspapers when I had a place that I identified as of interest, trawling through those for the tribunal reports and so on, getting more names, correlating, matching, effectively putting together a multi-thousand piece jigsaw and hoping that at the end of the day, it was all true and accurate and made sense. And that probably explains why it took so long. And it's still taking time. I see Barry's with us. Barry Mills, yeah. Thanks, Barry, for all your help in doing that. Barry's a major contributor as far as the Lancashire names are concerned, and much further afield. And there are other people who I can see here who similarly helped me. So as I said at the beginning, it's not just a me, it's an us. And perhaps I should rename it. Although I can't think of an alternative which summarizes the collectivity of the Pearce Register. So Pearce Register it is for the time being.
Could I just say I've moved beyond Lancashire now because obviously with the lockdown you can't get to libraries and archives. So I've been looking at the excuse me, British Newspaper Archive online, and it costs, I think it's 25 quid for 3 months, unlimited access. So I think I've already sent you stuff on Oxford and Cambridge, and having dipped into your book, I'm now looking at Reading. If anybody wants a lockdown project, you can just go onto British Newspaper Archive, and as I say, it's not very much. I think it's pro-rata bit cheaper if you're going for a year, and you can spend as long as you like on that. And it varies. Some places they don't give the names, and then you find other places that do.
Thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Barry. And there you go. Stuart watching later on YouTube. You've had a good informative answer to your question. And thanks, Dan, for rescuing it for me. Another question is, I'm very interested in the international network element about this. Do you know whether there was any linkage between British CO networks and, for instance, French or Belgian ones?
The simple answer is no.
You don't know, or there weren't any links?
I don't know.
Well, okay.
It would be pretentious of me to suggest that I did. I've not come across any links with the French or the Belgian. There are certain links of a tenuous kind with a small group of Belgian anarchists who made their way to Whiteways, the anarchist community outside Stroud, and then disappeared from there to goodness knows where, North America in some cases. But beyond that, I have to confess that I know little of the French or Belgian element that you might consider part of the anti-war movement. No. Leave that for somebody else.
Okay, well, Ali was waving at me. Ali?
Hi, thanks, Cyril. It's always fantastic to see you talk. Thank you so much. That's really great, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I suppose, as you know, I'm always interested in the women, and I think there's a lot of work to be done about mapping the communities of women, because I think the women, mostly from the suffrage and the socialist backgrounds, had huge networks before the war,
Yep.
and they were still doing that while the war was going on. And I'm very interested, you know, in the Women's Peace Crusade, which had about 123 crusades, largely forgotten now. But I'm always been interested to try and map those on the areas, and it would be very interesting to map them on your heartland areas to see how that happened. I don't know if there was one in. I know there was one in Aberdare, and I guess there was one in Merthyr as well. But it would be interesting to do that. So I think, and my point really about internationalism, of course, these women were involved internationally with other women across Europe and the USA. So you had things, you know, like the Zurich Conference, the Hague Congress. So I think there's a lot more going on than we realize. And sometimes I think some of the papers were destroyed because people knew that they were under surveillance, and, you know, a lot of the stuff I think has been lost. And you really have to track it. The Manchester CO Journal, for instance, is in Pennsylvania or wherever it, you know, the Swarthmore place in America. So it's kind of complicated, I think, because I think there was a huge network of safe houses, of people going to talk at different rallies and things like that. And a lot of the women were there because the men were in prison. So yeah, that would be my point, really. Yeah. And I think a lot of the women, you know, like one of my heroines a bit far back now, Margaret Ashton, you know, you could see that they become politicized by what happens in the war and become much more radical in their views. So, yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, did you have more you wanted to say, Cyril, on that?
No, I was just waiting for the cue to say something.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've got a couple more questions here.
Yeah,
have you looked at?
Just say this to Ali that.
Oh yes, please.
That her work on Manchester and the women's contribution to the anti-war movement in Manchester and further afield, actually in Lancashire, has been crucial to the way I've written the Lancashire Heartland section.
Oh, thank you.
So I hope I've done good service to her research, but I'm very grateful to her and to lots of other people who worked on aspects of this work that I couldn't possibly have done from scratch all by myself. And in that spirit, I've also tried to incorporate, wherever I found it, any evidence of participation in the Women's Peace Crusade. You will find wherever I'm describing an anti-war community's activities, and I've got some time or some space or some evidence about the women's contribution, that the Peace Crusade comes out very strongly, whether it's in Nels, which we know about, whether it's in Bradford, whether it's in Manchester, whether it's in South Wales. In fact, it was the wife of the minister at the Nonconformist chapel in Britton Ferry who was the key figure in the Women's Peace Crusade in that part of South Wales. So South Wales is not without its representation there. I'd also like to reinforce what Ali was saying about the women's movement networks. The women's movement networks before the war, those parts of that women's movement who didn't take the Pankhurst pro-war line, the women's movement networks before the war that survived and became part of the anti-war network were very important indeed in a number of different ways. First of all, I think, as we can see both in Manchester and particularly in Bristol and elsewhere, it was some of the leadership figures in the women's movement network who took against the war, who were the active leadership within the No Conscription Fellowship and in those organizations supporting conscience objectors. Once the men who founded those movements and were its prime movers at the beginning started to disappear into prison. The women were the ones, particularly in Croydon, Manchester and elsewhere, who raised the money to keep the CEOs' families going. And there's some lovely stories about the Croydon women, for example, making up a party to go to sing carols outside Wormwood Scrubs at Christmas 1917. There's also a story of them asking the Home Secretary if they could be allowed to send Christmas puddings to conscience objector prisoners in Wormwood Scrubs, which the Home Secretary regretfully denied them. Those are, if you like, the one end of that. But I think it's also important to say that the women's movement underground, which is so important when we have suffragettes run on the run, was also used in many places for conchies on the run. That's certainly true in Huddersfield, in a number of different parts of the town. It's certainly true in parts of Manchester. And Ali and I have been exchanging evidence over quite some time now about a remarkable woman from Huddersfield who went to Sheffield and helped the anti-war movement and the women's movement there, fetched up in Manchester Connie Robson, or Connie Crossland as she became. Very important figure there, one of the many unsung heroines of the broader anti-war community. And I would hate to think I'd ever denied the importance of the women's movement as a contributor to the anti-war communities of Britain. Thanks.
John's asking about Leeds and the women involved in the Beeston Brotherhood in Leeds. Have you looked at them?
Oh yeah, Beeston Brotherhood is quite fascinating. The women around that were important, active in the anti-war movement, to the extent, for example, that the headquarters of the Beeston Brotherhood, also referred to as the Hunslet Brotherhood Church, and their workshop and collective, if you like, was a well-known refuge for CEOs on the run. Some rather good stories about it, written by a member of the Brotherhood Church movement, who eventually settled at a Brotherhood Church centre in Pontefract, just outside Pontefract, about the Beeston Brotherhood at any one time being host to about a dozen CEOs who should really have been in the army, constantly being besieged by the police, but the CEOs always getting away. And there was one lovely story about Beeston, which I rather like, which is that one CEO there was found that the Beeston Brotherhood Church facilities was getting a bit too hot for him in terms of police attendance. So given that he had some friends who were serving time in Wakefield Work Centre, and the work centre was itself under a fairly loose regime, not a prison anymore, he took himself off to Wakefield Work Centre. He was welcomed there by his fellow CEOs. He spent some time there doing a bit of work, getting fed, board and lodgings. And when he'd had enough of the Wakefield Work Centre, since he wasn't on anybody's register, he walked away. Spent the rest of the war doing what he wanted to do somewhere else. So Beeston's very important in terms of that. I think there's an awful lot more to say about Leeds, which I hope I've got a sense of in the book. The role, for example, grossly underplayed, I think, nationally. You've got me going now, sorry about this. The role in Leeds of the radical elements of the Jewish community has been largely overlooked. Similarly, the radical elements of the Jewish community in Manchester and in parts of North London, Hackney and so forth. Some of them anarchists, some of them democratic socialists of one kind or another, products of the late 19th century diaspora from Eastern Europe, from Tsarist Russia, but bringing with them all their intellectually vigorous engagement with social and political issues. And certainly they didn't hold back when it came to an intellectual engagement with the issues around First World War. And there's some very nice accounts of Leeds Jewish community and members of that community supporting CEOs and indeed being CEOs themselves, which I hope I've captured as best I can in the book. Thank you.
Great. Is it anybody else want to wave at me? Anybody got a question they want to ask? I'm going to whiz through. Oh, I'm thinking we might have Yeah, we might be getting there, right? Final call. Yeah, if you look in the chat, there's various interesting things there, and Jane has reminded us of where you can get a copy of Cyril's book. And Cyril, I will forward you the chat because there are various things in there that are very complimentary and also of interest to you information-wise. So yeah, as ever, we have a very knowledgeable audience as well as being appreciative. I think we are, however, getting to the end. So I would like, on behalf of everybody, to say a big thank you again to Cyril, whose expertise really seems to know no bounds on this topic, and it is an extraordinary length and depth of research that you have been doing for so long. And as I say, good luck with all those on your list of next steps. And certainly, if anyone wants to be put in touch with Cyril to assist him in creating a website or anything else like that, then just let us know, and we'll certainly pass that on. Yeah, fab as always, as Ali says. So now next week, unfortunately, our speaker has had to postpone his talk because his lecture timetable has changed during lockdown. So we're really sorry, there isn't going to be a talk next week. So in a fortnight's time, in fact, a fortnight and a day's time, we look forward to seeing you again. Unusually, we're running the next talk on a Thursday. So on the 19th of November, Thursday the 19th, same time, 2 o'clock. We will be hoping to see you all again. The reason for that is it's History Day and it's the Being Human Festival Day, and our Begin the World Over Again podcast project is going to be launching at that point, and we're looking forward to sharing with you. People who are involved in that project will be sharing with you both their process and some of the outcomes of the podcast, which is all going to be very exciting. So we do hope to see you again then, Thursday the 19th of November, 2 o'clock. If you've missed some of today, or if you want to tell your friends how good it is and to let them know about it, it's going to be uploaded later to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/WCM Library. And I will remind you as ever that we have a donate button on our website, and we'd be delighted if you felt able to use that. So although the library may have to be closed to the public in terms of its actual door, its virtual door remains very much open. If you want to email us any inquiries or anything really, we'd just love to hear from you and keep the communication going. So there's a contact us button on our website. And so I think that's probably it. Thank you very much again to everybody, but obviously particularly to Cyril. So from everybody at the Working Class Movement Library, take care. In solidarity from us all, goodbye.
Bye-bye.